A portion of this PowerPoint is borrowed from class notes from the Introduction to the Old Testament, CMS 201. Each one of the books of the Old Testament is outlined with a royal theme, and for the book of Daniel, that royal theme is the king rules Babylon and Persia. The king referred to here is not Nebuchadnezzar or Cyrus, but instead is a reference to Yahweh as the king of all the earth. In order to understand the connection between Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah as young men who are transported to Babylon and instructed in the University of Babylon, we need to see those first couple of chapters in the context of the whole of the book. We see in this outline the historical introduction of the book of Daniel, in which the first chapter and a portion of the second chapter were in the original language written in Hebrew. Beginning at chapter 2 verse 4 and through the end of chapter 7, this section dealing with God's sovereignty over the Gentile nations is written in Aramaic, which is the royal language of the Babylonian Empire. And so God shows himself to be sovereign over man's interpretations, over man's idolatry, over his influence, over his insolence before God, over his irreverence, and over his imperial powers. In chapters 8 through 12, we go back to something focused on Israel, and so in the original language it is written in Hebrew. In chapter 8, there is the focus on the symbolic vision of an empire arising. In chapter 9, we have the 70 weeks of the Messiah. And in chapters 10 through 12, we have serious trouble for Israel and hope on the horizon. And of course, that horizon is with the end of the age, including the resurrection of the saved and the condemned. The title for this slide and the next could just as easily be Babylonian Reprogramming. Basically, they took young men, the best and brightest young men from Jerusalem. They took them to Babylon in the year 605. And changed everything about them in order to reprogram their thinking. So they changed their location from Judah to Babylon. They changed their language from Hebrew to Aramaic. They changed the literature that they studied from the Torah to Babylonian mythology. They changed their diet from what would have been a kosher diet based on Leviticus 11 to the king's provisions. And then their instructors, instead of having rabbis as instructors, they had the wise men or the magi who were their instructors. In order to change their worldview, their understanding of the reality around them, they took the reprogramming one step further by changing the very names of these young men. And so we have 4 men whose names are based on a covenant relationship with Yahweh. And Daniel, whose name means "my God is judge," is renamed Belteshazzar, meaning Bel, protect his life. Hananiah, whose name means Yahweh is gracious, was renamed as Shadrach or Shadrachu, which means under the command of Aku. Mishael, which means who is like God, his name was changed to Mishaku, which is who is like Aku. And then Azariah, whose name means Yahweh has helped, his name was changed to Abed-Nego, which means servant of Nego or Nebo. And by changing these names so that they identified with the pantheon of Babylonian gods, their purpose was to reprogram their thinking not to believe in Yahweh as the one true God, but that Bel and Aku and other gods of the Babylonian pantheon were in fact the reality. In his book Loving God with All Your Mind, author Gene Veith compares Daniel and his companions in the, quote, University of Babylon with Christians today facing belligerent faculty, administration, and fellow students in secular universities. The point that Veith makes in his book is that in order to honor God and love Him with our whole being, we are to love Him with all our heart, all our soul, all our mind, and with all our strength. And so we're not to check our minds at the door. As we look at the example of Daniel and his friends, we see in the first couple of chapters of the book of Daniel several things. First, they determined not to compromise. Now, the dietary issue seems to be a relatively light conviction, and yet it was not a light thing for them. They determined not to compromise even in this area. Secondly, they determined to respect authority. When it came to not eating the king's food, they went through proper channels and a testing period so that no one would get in trouble. Third, they determined to master their studies. Daniel determined to master his studies, and so did his companions. And as a result of that, God gave them favor. Not only did they know what they believed, but they also understood with greater depth what the Babylonians believed and the differences between them. And then finally, in chapter 2, when called before the king, actually, he makes an appointment with the king, Daniel is determined to honor his master, that is, his king, Yahweh. And chapter 2, verses 17 through 30, we see how all of this plays out. This slide and the next two which follow contain reading guide questions for parts 1, 2, and 3 in Loving God with All Your Mind by author Gene Veith. These reading guide questions for Veith's book are found separately in lists in modules 9, 10, and 11 of CMS 310 Christian Worldview. We want to encourage you to read through the whole section of Veith with each module, and then go back and answer the reading guide questions.